Okay, so you want me to start or?
Yes.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I guess I wanted to talk about three. Sorry. No, I don't. No. Sure, yeah. Perfect. Is it already on or? Let me see. I'm clicking the green button, but I don't know whether anything is gonna happen. Oh, shoot. Okay. So, yeah. Okay, perfect. So I guess three main things that I wanted to touch upon, after this talk was, things that I'm excited about, thinking about my organization, which is financial institutions, is generative AI. I think it's going to be playing a huge part, when you think about the future, blockchain, digital assets, and also virtual reality and augmented reality. So I'll kind of group it as metaverse, but we can talk about it in more detail. So I guess when we think about and this is actually taken from ChatGPT, as kind of I'm sure everybody will know when we talk about generative AI. And this is something that I know it's very, on top of trend. Everybody's talking about it, how it will transform, financial institutions, and I'm gonna read it out now because ChatGPT gave me the explanation of what is actually, when we talk about generative AI, what actually do we mean by that. So, generative artificial intelligence refers to a type of AI technology that can generate new content such as text, images, audio, video, based on the data it has been trained on, and I think that's really, really important. It is achieved through machine learning models that have learned patterns, structures, and characteristics from large data sets, so allowing them to produce new original outputs that are similar in nature to the training data. Next step. So when we think about examples of generative AI, I feel there's a broad range of use cases. It's content creation, it's art and design, it's entertainment and media, it's legal and administrative tasks, it's financial services, engineering, legal language translations, and localizations. And one thing I think it's really important, and I think that's becoming more and more important when we talk about generative AI, is if you look at legal and regulatory potential challenges. So for example, when you think about generative AI and you think about organizations that do not have, for example, somebody who is looking at your AI strategy. I read a recent article that suggested it would be really, really important to have somebody on the C-level suite, a chief AI officer that kind of looks across your whole organization and kind of tries to figure out, okay, what is the AI strategy for my organization? What do we need to be mindful of? And I kind of looking that generative AI is kind of deployed effectively, efficiently, and ethically. It's also really, really important to note, the European Union. I think I don't want to say it's further ahead in terms of regulation, but they put out some guidance in terms of when we talk about generative AI, what do we need to be mindful of, right? What kind of challenges that could impose. So they talked about for example, challenges or concerns around the impact of artificial intelligence and the labor market. So for example, jobs that will be being destroyed by automation in the future potentially, for example. They also talked about the impacts of algorithms and autonomous decision-making systems. So in terms of safety, liability, if something goes wrong, for example, who is being held accountable for that. The European Union regulation also looked at digital assets, blockchain, what are some potentially concerns around that. Disinformation spreading or fake news, I think it's going to be a huge topic, in particular when we think about presidential elections coming up in the States this year. I think that's also going to be a huge topic, and then also potentially military applications of algorithms in terms of autonomous weapons and and cybersecurity. So I think the main takeaway when I read through the European, regulations was, for me, it's three things. It's transparency in terms of when you, for example, train your data or train your algorithm in terms of what data sets are you going to be using, how are you going to train your algorithm, can it be traced back, it's documented, it's traceable. It's kind of making sure that you can relate it back. For example, if you're using, for example, ChatGPT and it tells you okay, this is my response to the answer. As a human being, you need to be able to understand how did the AI come to this conclusion, what data sets has been used for that. And then also, I think as a human being, it's also really, really important to understand if you're facing content that has been generated by artificial intelligence, that as a user, you should be made aware of that. You should be kind of knowing, okay, this content has been generated by, AI, I'm aware of that. And I think Facebook or Meta, they recently released some guidance that they said future content will be labeled as such. That, for example, that that this has been generated by generative AI, that you're aware of that. Another, I think questions that within my organization, I know 100% people are gonna ask okay, so my job that I'm doing today, is my job safe in the future? Do I think I'm gonna be replacing my role and my job will be replaced by machines in the future? And when I think about that, I usually think AI or augmented reality, artificial intelligence. It's it's basically here to augment our efficiency at work. So any task, for example, that is manual, that is kind of tedious, it's kind of repetitive and dull, can be replaced by artificial intelligence. I don't think in the future AI will replace every aspect of every job that we are doing. It definitely will help, but I also think it gives us time to focus really on the value-added tasks. For example, things that cannot be done by machines today, critical thinking, building relationships, empathy, by complex problem solving. I think these are the skill sets in the future. If you think about it, will become really, really important. We need to understand that, we need to acknowledge that, and I think the people who kind of try to figure out, okay, how can I implement AI, how can I implement, for example, Microsoft, Copilot into my day-to-day job, I think these people will be replacing, people who will not or do not want to, talk about this technology in the future. I think that's very, very key to understand, and I also think when we think about skill sets of the future that we would need, it's really, really important to assess, for example, do we need to upskill, do we need to reskill our current workforce, and if so, how do we gonna do that? Two examples that really resonated well within my organization is so for example, when we looked at blockchain technology about 3 years ago, it was really imperative for us to really liaise with all the relevant business units to understand what are your current challenges, where is a lot of manual tasks that we could, for example, automate it, and how can we leverage the new technology, just the generative AI or AI and machine learning to automate some of these tasks. So taking your employees along the journey with you, I think it's very imperative. Do that earlier on to really educate, in terms of this is the new technology, this is how we can leverage it, this is how we can use it, and kind of learn from each other. I think it's really, really important. Another thing that really resonated really, really well within our organization was last year, for example, we hosted a hackathon, where we looked at AI and machine learning, and we made a conscious effort to really include the people that are non-data scientists, that are non-coders, that are working in operational areas, and we really wanted to hear more about okay, so you're doing all of these tasks that are really manual, that are really repetitive. How can we really leverage the technology to help you to automate some of these tasks so you can actually spend your time that you're spending on that to do something else? I actually participated in this hackathon, and one of the, I guess, like winning use cases was that we were looking into, you know, when you, for example, you have a meeting and somebody takes the notes, like, you know, what was discussed, like, you know, what are the next steps, who attended, scheduling follow-up meeting. Is there a way of like kind of like automating all of that so that you don't actually have to write all of that manually? Like, for example, for every meeting that lasts an hour, it would take me 30 minutes to write all of those notes. So for example, could we create like a way of automating all of that and potentially maybe build a chatbot that sits, you know, on top of Teams, and I can query, hey, you know, what did we discuss 2 weeks ago on these meetings? What are my follow-up points, for example? And that chatbot will basically give the information today. So I think, like, you know, things like that are really, really key, that we think, like, you know, okay, if we automate this, I could actually spend some more time on, like, you know, building out solutions, building out, like, you know, some things that I think, like, more value out to my organization. So just some food for thoughts. Another question that we usually get asked is kind of like, you know, are financial institutions, like, you know, ready to add generative AI to their organizational frameworks? And I always say, like, you know, it's not really so much about the technology, you know, it's not really about, like, you know, implementing, for example, ChatGPT into every single aspect of, like, you know, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, because it could bring a lot of, like, challenges and risk with it. So for example, if you think about, like, maybe you have a sales team and, you know, they try to, for example, input, like, you know, information into ChatGPT about their clients, you know, this could actually result in, you know, a lot of data breaches and privacy breaches that, you know, you could potentially be held liable for. It's more about, like, you know, finding really the right use case. Like, what does make sense? What does it make sense to explore? Why we should explore it, and kind of, like, you know, follow down the path, but also understand, like, you know, there are some fundamental elements, you know, if you think about ChatGPT, for example, or generative AI, that we need to, you know, be mindful of, like, you know, before we implement it. For example, such as, like, you know, do we have fast and secure networks and connectivity in place? Do we have a data infrastructure in place? So it's imperative, like, you know, to understand, like, you know, is the data that I'm using to train the models, is it accurate? Is it kind of like complete, like, you know, is it safe, like, you know, that you can use it? And then also think about, like, you know, items or things like, you know, for example, cybersecurity, like, you know, is my data safe, for example, so that I can actually use it? So I think I would always questioning or, like, you know, kind of like re-emphasizing, like, you know, make sure that you have all of these steps completed, thought through, before you actually think about, like, you know, incorporating ChatGPT or any other, like, you know, AI tools within your organization, for example. Another thing that I'm very excited about, like, you know, and I think it's gonna, you know, be huge in the future, is about, you know, blockchain technology, in particular of, like, you know, tokenization of real-world assets. This definition, like, you know, about, like, you know, what is blockchain was actually taken from ChatGPT, so I'm gonna read it out, but it's kind of like says, like, blockchain is a decentralized and distributed ledger technology that records transactions across multiple computers, multiple computers in such a way that registered transactions cannot be altered retroactively. So I think this technology, like, you know, blockchain technology is foundational, like, you know, for cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, but, like, you know, I'm thinking about it more from a, you know, the future of digital assets, in particular, like, you know, tokenization, like, you know, when we think about, like, you know, blockchain use cases in finance, things that we are looking into from a, you know, State Street perspective is, like, you know, for example, how can we deploy smart contracts, meaning, like, you know, automating the execution of contracts in financial transactions to increase efficiency, reduce manual interventions. Then we have asset tokenization, which I feel like, you know, everybody's hyping it up, like, you know, this is going to be the future. It's kind of like a, you know, representing real world assets on the blockchain, and kind of like, you know, converting, like, rights to the assets, like, in terms of, like, ownership, and then, you know, it kind of, like, brings efficiencies with it. I think, like, tokenization is going to be, like, you know, a huge topic for financial, like, institutions in the future. Another aspect is, like, you know, cross-border payments, like streamlining and reducing the cost of international transactions. For cross-border payments, it's going to be important, and then supply chain finance, which involves improving transparency and traceability in supply chains to reduce fraud and operational risks. So I think it's really important to talk about the challenges that I have seen. So within my organization, we looked at, for example, digital assets. We looked at tokenization, and it's there's a lot of use cases out there, but I feel it's a bit challenging in terms of we need to create an environment that is inclusive, an ecosystem that is inclusive. So for example, if you start thinking about it, what kind of blockchain do we want to use? Do we want to use a private one? Do we want to use a public one? Education plays a really, really important key. All the relevant stakeholders, in particular on the C-suite, kind of what is it? What is this technology for? What do we want to leverage it for? What kind of use cases can we use it for? And then also really, really important, if we have conversation with our clients to really understand what are the use cases? Why do you want to use blockchain technology? Why do you want to tokenize, for example, an asset? What additional benefit does it give to you, right? I feel there's always this kind of I don't want to say fight, but between internal operational efficiency, right, that the blockchain technology gives you, but then also what are some of the use cases or new revenue opportunities that it gives to you. So it's kind of really figuring out why do we want to pursue that aspect, right? And then also regulatory clarity, which I think is key from a US perspective. You have the SEC, you have the CFTC. They kind of really have to define what are digital assets. Is it kind of is it is it commodities? Is it kind of spot market? Whatever it is, we need regulatory clarity so that we know from an, for example, financial institutional perspective, what can and we cannot do with technology, with this technology for our clients. So I think these are some of the aspects that I think we need to think through. We need to get some more clarity on in order to really, really ensure that there's adoption. I think that the technology is really, really great. I just think we need to make sure that there's a marketplace there. There is a secondary marketplace there for trading, and we need to make sure we're moving away from proof of concepts to actually building out real world products that everybody within the ecosystem can participate in. So I think that's really, really key from that aspect. The last thing that I want to touch upon is augmented reality and virtual reality. I highlighted some definitions here and what do we mean by AR and VR. One thing that I wanted to point out is that I was actually really, really impressed, during COVID, for example, when we moved towards having meetings in person to kind of suddenly we're having meetings in Zoom, in Teams. How quickly we could adopt in this shift of change of these things. And I think when, for example, I think about trying on the first VR headset, Oculus Go, and then trying out the Apple headsets Vision Pro. I think the technology has come a long way. I think it's not there yet to fully adopt it, but I think there's a huge potential in the future in terms of having meeting in a metaverse, for example, meeting with clients where we can actually, for example, look at meeting them in the metaverse, bringing in data from for example from Salesforce that I only can see, having the data visualization in 3 dimensions, in AR and VR. They can get different depths of the data. It's become really, really, I would say that's going to be the future of how we interact with this technology. Another thing that I think it's really, really interesting to note is for example, today when you think about if you're having, setting up a workstation for your employees, you have to have 3 screens, docking station, a mouse, keypad. In the future, I think this can all be replaced by actually, for example, having a virtual headset that costs maybe $1,000, so a fraction of the cost that you need, and you can have a virtual workstation that you can take with you anywhere that you want, and you can have this additional benefits, if you wanted to try it out. 2 of the use cases, and these are actually real life use cases we worked on, was first of all if you scan a QR code with your phone, you will be able to kind of like interact with it. But like one of them was kind of like a digital representations of our new headquarters. You know, if you wanted to give, like, for example, clients, like, you know, feel like, you know, oh, this is our new headquarters, take a look at that, you know, in virtual reality. And another one was like a data visualization aspect. So I feel like, you know, if the technology, like, you know, actually will adopt, like, you know, data visualization in VR and AR is gonna be huge in the future, because, like, you know, visualization in 3 dimension gives you additional depth on the data set that you wouldn't get necessarily within 2 dimensions. So feel free to try either one of those QR codes, see what you think, you know, I'm more than happy, like, you know, to walk you through it and see how you can set it up. But I think that's going to be key in the future. I know I'm out of time, so I'll stop it here.